So to start, I'm going to give you an overview of the communication process. So naturally in real life, it's really not this linear, but this is a way to think about the overall process and the kind of key phases. So our focus tonight will be on number 2, on listening, but I'll go over all of the phases briefly so that you can see how listening fits into the bigger picture. So the first phase is to prepare, and um, um, that. Sorry, I'm just trying to. Whoops. The first phase is to prepare, and in this, it's a really good idea to figure out what you want from the communication. So if you actually think about it, you might find that in fact you want to prove that you're right and the other person is wrong, or you might discover that you want to look good or you want to vent your anger. And if you want any of those kind of things, then you're not really going to make any headway. Your conversation really won't accomplish anything. However, you might want to discover where an acquaintance stands on climate change, or you might want to build common ground with somebody who doesn't agree with you about climate change yet. Or you might want to encourage somebody who you know thinks about climate change a lot. You might want to encourage them to start taking action. And all of these things start with the premise that the person that you're talking to is basically a good person, and that they have their own reasons for believing what they do and acting in the ways that they do. And you know, the point of your conversation is really to try and understand that, to figure out who they are and why they're doing what they're doing. You also need to establish that safety through connection, through your energy, really. You need to be sensitive to place, to time, to hunger, to irritation, to all of the things which, you know, can derail an otherwise good conversation. So the next phase is listening to the other person, and the skill set that I'm going to look at are the ones which motivational interviewing identifies, which is different to what the other guys did online. So in motivational interviewing, they say if you're up a creek, you use your oars, your open-ended questions, your affirmations, your reflections, and your summaries. So they're the skills that we're going to look at tonight. And so after you've listened, or while you're listening, you want to consider some of these questions. You know, what are my filters or lenses? We've all got our own filters and lenses that can distort or oversimplify what we're receiving from the world. For example, you know, we all use stereotypes to kind of quickly figure out, you know, how to react to people, but they can really get in the way of the conversations that we're having. We try and make sense of the world by using stories, but these stories are not always representative of the truth. So, for example, there's a woman that I know. Her daughter goes to the same kindy as mine. And I started to talk to her one day about the work that I do for CCL. And she kind of just clammed up and changed the subject. And I immediately made up a story in my head that said that perhaps she didn't believe in climate change and she didn't want to talk about it. And so I just retreated onto safer ground, and, you know, we talked about other things. And it wasn't until several months later that she actually brought it up again. And I realised that all of the stories that I had made up about that were not correct. And in fact, she was quite concerned about climate change. And the thing is that we base our actions on the stories that we make up. And if our stories aren't valid, then the actions that we take can be ineffective or even harmful. And so in this case, it was obviously a very mild example, but, you know, there were all these conversations that I could have been having with her that I didn't, because, you know, I'd made up this story in my head about you know, what she did or didn't believe. So the talking, I'm actually going to skip this because I think it's kind of a little bit complicated. We've talked in this forum before about how to talk about climate change, and if you want to sort of see Chris, whatever his name is, going through this, then you can always go online to the other one. So while you're talking, you kind of always need to be checking if you or the other person is becoming reactive. So if they're showing signs of fight or flight or freeze kind of behaviour. So they might be, for example, some of the freeze behaviour is masking. They might be saying they're fine when you know that they're not. They might be avoiding by changing the subject. They might be withdrawing, so making excuses to leave. And that was what I thought my friend was doing. They might be freezing into silence or passivity or placating you, or they might be fighting. You know, they might be becoming controlling or attacking or aggressive, or they might be labelling, talking about tree huggers or bloody protesters or bleeding heart greenies or something like that. So if you sense any reactivity in you or the other person, then you really need to stop talking about content right there, because nothing will be achieved. And you need to then adjust before you do anything else. But if both of you are receptive, then you can just continue. Some skills for adjusting. You can clarify your meaning or your intent by using clear parameters. So, for example, you might say, I don't mean that we should stop burning fossil fuel tomorrow, but I do mean that we should be taking sensible steps to phase them out. You know, you're clearly saying what it is that you do mean and what it is that you don't. You might try reaffirming your mutual purpose. For example, we both want a good world for our kids to grow up in, if you've got kids in common. You might try reaffirming your respect for that person. You might say, look, you're a smart guy, Dave, you've done a lot for our company, or whatever. Or you might try returning to your relationship. You might say, I don't really want to argue about this because our relationship's really important to me. And also, if you have made a mistake or spoken out of line, then really just apologise, because that happens and it's fine. If you and the other person are receptive, then you can just continue. Obviously, in real life, it's not this linear, so it just kind of, this gives you a basic overview. Now, I want to just do a warm-up activity. So I'm going to give you a few minutes just to think about a time when a listener thoroughly understood you and accepted you for who you were. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the video, the recording, and I'm just going to talk through these questions and see if some of you have responses to that. So just think about somebody who's listened to you well. Okay. So we're just going to move through this. Okay, so the good listener that you were thinking of was really trying to understand you, trying to construct a mental map of you and your way of being in the world. It's their way of really trying to see you as who you are. And it's actually quite unusual to come across good listening, which is such a shame. So these are the skills that will help you to become a good listener. Open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. And we're going to go through them now. So open-ended questions, you've probably, I'm almost certain you've come across this term before. Closed-ended questions are things that you can answer with a yes or a no, or a sort of specific answer like 3 weeks on Thursday or something like that. Whereas an open-ended question usually starts with one of the 5 W's: what, why, where, when, or how. And it really opens the discussion up. It allows the listener to build and fine-tune their mental model. We all have values that make climate change an issue for us, whether we realise it or not. And that might be care for our family, it might be care for the environment, it might be the jobs and economy, because if we care about jobs and economy, then the truth is we care about climate change. It might be a fair go for everyone, or it might be Australia's national security. And so using open-ended questions allows us to kind of look for these values and then later use them to frame what we have to say. We can start with small talk and then dive deeper. So, what are you up to over the holidays? It can become something else which aims to discover what the other person cares about, what they're passionate about. I think that it's important to remember that there's a place for closed questions. Did you see the documentary about the reef on Monday? Is a closed question which can direct the conversation in the direction that you want it to go. You might ask something like, is climate change something that you worry about? And if they say yes, then you can continue with an open-ended question like, what worries you most? And that would, be something you could start looking for values. Or if they say no, you could follow up with, how come? And when you are being so direct, it's important to keep the energy light and friendly and to be genuinely curious, to make sure that you're, remembering what your goals for the conversation are, which is often just to discover more about this person. It's best, you should avoid more than 3 questions in a row, because apparently that's very annoying. So affirmations. This is when you notice and comment on positive actions taken by the speaker or positive attributes that they might have. So if they're talking about things that they have done, to do with their family, you might say, you really care about your family. Or if they're, these are just examples. You've cut down your carbon footprint a lot. That must have taken guts. You might be reflecting on things that you think are important and that you want them to do more of, or you might be reflecting on things that show the kind of inner strengths and inner skills that we all need if we're going to face up to something like climate change. So it's a fine line, but you're generally wanting to move away from praise, which is about I as the listener think and feel about what you've done, and more towards noticing, because praise can often elicit negative reactions because the person feels judged. And again, this requires a genuine positive regard for the speaker, and you really need to have been listening carefully. I remember I used to have a boss who would just kind of indiscriminately and over-enthusiastically praise everything that I did. And really, it just made me feel in the end like he was a bit of an idiot. It didn't make me feel like I was doing a great job. It just made me kind of feel like he wasn't really noticing what I was doing. So reflective listening. So this is where the speaker says something and you say it back to them in different words. And that's to show that you've heard and understood. And this is really the guts of active listening. So it can be very simple. You might just be kind of echoing something that they've said, or you can try and continue on and finish their thought, which is, it's more difficult, but it's really effective if you can manage it. or you can explicitly state things which they've only hinted at. If they're showing emotion, you can bring that emotion to their attention, again, gently. And this can be really powerful when done well. If you're not really sure what they mean, then you just make your best guess. And if you're wrong, then you can expect them to correct you. If you phrase it as a statement rather than a question, then it allows them, as long as you're correct, it allows them to continue talking without feeling that they have to answer you, which I found is quite powerful. It sort of removes roadblocks, because questions actually can be roadblocks because they stop the person's train of thought. And you're really trying to remove as many roadblocks as you can and just get them to kind of spool out and tell you everything that they're thinking. It's worth noticing that you're reflecting. You're not necessarily agreeing. In fact, you might really strongly disagree with what they're saying, but the aim is to let them know that you've heard them, because otherwise they won't want to move on. They're just going to want to keep on repeating that thing until they've felt heard. And the last skill is summarizing, which is a kind of reflection where you draw together different elements of what the person has said and you present it back to them. So pulling it all together in this way, it helps them to see their thoughts more coherently and to feel like you're really listening. So again, the examples that I've given here, from what you've just said, it sounds like you're sick of feeling powerless, but you're not quite sure what to do about it. So that's something, if you're talking about climate change and they've been kind of, going perhaps around in circles a little bit, then this would allow you to kind of launch into some of the stuff that you know about things that they could do about it. And it opens them to being ready to hear about that. Or the other example I've given is, so the bottom line is that you're worried about the economy if we start taking climate change seriously. And again, there are things that you can talk to them about that with, CCL and our excellent proposals. But you're not going to be able to get to that unless they really feel like you've heard them on this. Again, you don't need to be agreeing with what the person has said. You just need to be really hearing them. Again, just to sum up, you can help the conversation by not judging the person, by trying to make them feel that you're on their team, and by framing the issue using values that they care about. So you need to have been listening to them to figure out what they are. You can use your conversation to focus them on what needs to happen and how they could help. And that's really that's the basis of what motivational interviewing is about. And it's quite an in-depth thing, and it is quite amazing, the transformations that are possible. But obviously we're just kind of talking about basic listening skills tonight. So now we're going to do a little listening activity, and I'm going to, if this works, I'm going to try splitting us up into breakout rooms with 3 in each. So there's going to be a speaker, and that person is going to talk about something that you care deeply about. So if you're up for a challenge, you might take on the persona of a conservative and talk about your view of climate change, but that's just if you're up for a challenge. It just has to be something that you do care deeply about and that you can talk about. And the listener is going to use the active listening skills that we've just been talking about to draw out the speaker. I'm going to leave the oars up on the screen so that you can see that. And the goal is for the speaker to feel seen, heard, felt, and respected. And we'd like no responses other than active listening techniques. It's not a dialogue, it's just a listening exercise. And the observer is to take note of the listening skills used by the listener. And so when time is called, debrief among yourselves. The speaker, how well you were listened to. The observer, what listening skills did you observe? And the listener, how was this experience for you? So I'm just going to stop recording and